Did you know that 25% of Americans support Japanese imperialism? Well, maybe they don't, but that is how many Americans emigrated to Japan following World War II. And this might not be surprising considering the prevalence of Japanese culture in America today. What with the food, the anime and the games. But back in the early 20th century, Japan wasn't all that welcoming to foreigners. In fact, it was an imperial powerhouse intent on dominating East Asia. So why did so many Americans go there? Well, let's find out. This is a series that explores the great powers of the 20th century. Previous episodes can be found in the playlist linked below. Japan had become a major player on the world stage at the end of World War I, with its overseas empire in the Pacific, which it refers to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Japan was considered a great power, on par with the United States, Britain and France. At the Paris Peace Conference, the Japanese delegation was treated accordingly, even though Japan's emperor was still seen as a figurehead by many Western powers. A delegate from the Chinese Republic, who favored Japanese influence over the Russian Far East, would later write, "In the Far East, there are two great nations, Russia and Japan. Russia is socialist and Japan is capitalist. If we must choose one of them to help us, we prefer Japan." This was something of a surprise for many, as Japan in many ways flew in the face of Western Asia. It was capitalist and racist. So what happened? Well, to answer that, let's get the basics down. Japan is an archipelago of islands, sitting off the eastern coast of Asia. Its nearest neighbors are China, Korea, and Russia. As a result of the Russo-Japanese War, it gained control of Korea and parts of Sakhalin Island. Due to its geography, Japan had been largely isolated from the rest of the world, only having significant interaction with China, Korea, and Russia, and only really being known to the West through Dutch and Portuguese missionaries. This isolation ended during the Second World War, when American and British forces occupied Japan and forced it to open up its borders. Today, this is hard to imagine. Japanese cars, electronics and fashion dominate global markets. Japanese cuisine and anime have infiltrated pop culture, and thousands of Japanese immigrants live across the globe. However, it wasn't until the early 20th century that Japan became a prominent feature on the global stage. The reason for this sudden prominence was a man named Hirobumi Ito. Hirobumi Ito was Japan's first commoner and Christian prime minister. He is credited with turning Japan into a modern state capable of competing with the West. When he came to power in 1885, Japan's economy was agrarian, and it lacked the infrastructure needed to compete with the world's great powers. By 1901, Ito had modernized the country and established it as an imperial power. He began his career as a samurai before becoming a bureaucrat after the Meiji Restoration. After decades in office, he became prime minister in 1885. His tenure lasted just 8 years, but during this time he laid the foundations of modern Japan. Ito prioritized education and made primary school compulsory. He also created Japan's first constitution, which established the country as a constitutional monarchy. Perhaps most importantly, Ito modernized the military, moving away from conscripted farmers and creating a professional army. This military would later conquer much of East Asia. However, it was the next Prime Minister, Katsuro Ataro, who would lead Japan into war with Russia in 1904. Japan won the war, gaining control of Korea and part of Sakhalin Island. This victory stunned the world and thrust Japan onto the world stage. During World War I, Hiratakashi would continue to modernize Japan and prepare it for its new place in the world. While he was cautious about foreign entanglements, he recognized that Japan now had the opportunity to equal the Western powers. As such, he sent a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference to represent Japan. During the conference, Hira showed restraint. He refused to make territorial demands and instead supported the creation of an international mandate system. This surprised many Western delegates who were expecting Japan to push for expanded territory. However, Japan's representatives did demand the return of German-controlled Micronesia. Hira hoped that if Japan was seen as a reasonable power, then other nations would be more willing to accept its new position in the world. Hira's strategy paid off. Japan was invited to join the League of Nations, and Western powers grew increasingly reliant on Japan to contain communism in the Pacific. But this reliance didn't come cheap. Japan's entry into the Pacific mandated system required it to send troops to Siberia to fight the Bolsheviks, Japan fought alongside anti-Bolshevik forces for most of the Russian Civil War. Initially, the Japanese intervention was successful. By 1918, Japan and its allies had pushed the Bolsheviks back across Siberia. However, with the collapse of its European allies, Japan was forced to withdraw. Despite not achieving its goal of keeping Russia out of communist hands, the intervention did serve to further entrench Japan in East Asia. Through its actions in the region, Japan helped shape the political and economic order of the Pacific. Hera worked closely with both the Chinese and Korean governments. He provided financial aid to China and met with Korean officials to discuss independence. In 1921, he asked a group of Korean politicians to draw up plans for a Korean state. Some members of this group wanted independence, while others advocated for closer ties with Japan. Hera never saw the final report as it would be suppressed by his successors. Hera's policy towards Korea remains ambiguous. On one hand, he kept Korea under tight military control and cracked down on dissidents. On the other hand, he did raise the possibility of Korean independence. While Hera was progressive in many areas, he was extremely conservative when it came to race. During his tenure, the term Japanese nation was used interchangeably with the term Yamato race. To the Japanese, the Yamato race encompassed all people living in Japan, but it specifically referred to the ethnic majority. Over time, this definition would become increasingly rigid. In 1923, this rigidity would manifest itself in violence against Korea. On September 1st, an earthquake measuring 7.9 on the Richter scale struck Tokyo and Yokohama. Dubbed the Great Kanto Earthquake, it killed over 100,000 people and left millions homeless. Amidst the chaos, rumors spread that Koreans were purposely starting fires to loot homes. These rumors culminated in 3 days of rioting between Koreans and Japanese. While the violence was eventually put down, it would have a lasting impact on Japanese politics. The disaster left Tokyo in ruins, which damaged the government's finances. Rising inflation made recovery even more difficult. In response, the government raised taxes, which proved to be unpopular. The public blamed the government for mishandling the relief effort and called for more aggressive policies. This resentment towards the government coincided with a larger trend in Japanese politics. Over the previous decade, several liberal opposition parties had emerged. They criticized the government's handling of the economy and demanded more social reforms. In 1924, these parties nominated their own candidates for the House of Representatives election. Many of these candidates ran on platforms of land reform, which proved popular among poor farmers. This election, along with those in 1928 and 1930, are known as the three great elections of early 20th century Japan. The 1924 election was the closest contest of the three and resulted in a hung parliament. The Liberals failed to win a majority, but they did gain enough seats to form a coalition government with the Rikken Seikai Party. This party was formed by younger members of the Zaibotsu who wanted more radical reforms. Together, the Liberals and the Ritsuren Sakai Party attempted to implement sweeping changes. However, these attempts were undermined by the government's inability to address the country's economic problems. By 1927, Japan's economy was stagnant. The value of the yen had fallen significantly, which limited Japan's ability to import raw materials. This, in turn, hurt industry, which led to unemployment. In response to these growing pains, the government cracked down on labor unions, which further inflamed the public. Growing discontent allowed the conservatives to make a comeback in the 1928 and 1930 elections. In both cases, the conservatives were able to form coalition governments without the need for compromise. For the conservatives, this meant that it was back to business as usual. Korea would remain under martial law, and the military would continue to grow in power. It would take another 16 years for Japan to embrace democracy, and by that time, it would be too late. Japan would spend the 1930s conquering much of East Asia, only to be defeated by the very democracies it sought to destroy. A version of this video was originally posted on my blog. Be sure to check it out for weekly posts on history. Thanks for watching.